I'm going to rebuild this alternator. It's from my older Chevy pickup, and I like these alternators the best because it's so simple that anybody can actually rebuild one of these. You don't have to do any soldering, nothing. You just need a few little wrenches and you can rebuild this. And the rebuild kit is pretty cheap to buy. First of all, what you should do is mark it here. Take a marker and mark it so you put it back in the same position, because for different applications it's put together in different ways. We first start out by taking these all four of these bolts out. Once we've taken all four of these out, just kind of pry it in here a little bit, and these windings right here have to stay with the back part of the alternator. So you got to get in there and pry it off like that, and then just pull it out, and there you have that part and this part. We'll just put this part aside and we'll deal with this side. What we have to do here is take this nut off to take the pulley off and replace the bearing in here. So there's actually two ways you can do that. You can put a Allen wrench inside here to hold it and take a box end wrench and unscrew it. Or what I usually do, if you have an impact wrench, you could just put it on here and take it off like that. Make sure you wear a glove to hold it, because sometimes it can be tight, pretty rusty, and you might hurt yourself. Once you pull all that off, there's a washer and there's a little spacer here. This one has two little spacers. One there and one inside here. And then this can come off. There you have this. And have to take this little plate off, and then the bearing will come out. I see that somebody has replaced this already once, because there's a different kind of screw here. Once you've taken this little plate off, then it's a matter of just getting the bearing out. What I usually do is it's usually not in there too hard, so what I do is I take a socket Now once we have this kind of all cleaned up, make sure this shaft is nice and clean. Make sure your slip rings here are nice. If they're really rough, just take an emery cloth and smoothen them out. Check with your meter to see if none of these windings in here are shorted out. You can put it on the diode tester section and just put one here and one ground, and if there's no beep, it's a good thing. Same thing with this one. And if these two beep, that's a good thing too, because there's a complete circuit there. Once this is all done here, you can just push this back in. Then there's this tiny little spacer that fits inside there. And then there was this spacer. Then the fan. Then this spacer. Then this pulley. Then the washer. And then the nut. Now you can tighten up the nut the same way with the impact wrench, or just use a Allen wrench inside here and then a box end wrench outside. Now we redo this, the other part. Here's your brush holder. Here's all your diodes. Here's your diode trio. And underneath the brush holder is the regulator. So first of all, we have to take these here windings out. And that is with these three little bolts here, little screws. See, they just come off like that. Put that aside. Now we just take this brush holder off. This whole assembly will come off. This is the diode trio here. Brush holder. We're going to put new brushes in. This is the regulator, and these are the diodes. We're going to take these diodes out and clean this all up, and then put a new bearing in the back here. So there's just a couple of screws here, one here and one here. This one is the battery post that goes right through. And it's insulated here, so you have to make sure you put all that back together like that. once you take this screw out that holds this battery connection in, you can pull this right out, and there's that little insulator. And then this other screw comes out, and that all comes apart. Now I'm going to take and pound this bearing out, but you have to be careful when you're pounding this bearing out. Don't pound it like this, because if you pound it like this, it'll come out, of course, and you might be okay, but you might break this whole thing off here, because there's nothing in here that's holding it. So what you have to do is put something underneath here to hold it, and then you can pound this out. Or what you can do is, what I do here is I put it in the vise, turn the vise down a little bit, and then I'll put my socket inside there that just fits in the bearing, and then I'll put a block of wood on here and I'll pound it out that way. Again, we'll check the diodes here to make sure they're all good so they're not shorted out. Put one there and one on ground. Seems all good. Then we can put this in first back. Make sure this little insulator is not broken up or anything. That bolt back in. This screw back in. And then this other screw that holds this condenser in. Tighten them all back up. Make sure you put the brushes in the same way they came out. Put your springs in, and then just push your brushes in top and down there, and then you take a piece of wire, push it in that little hole to hold the brushes in. Then you do the same on the other side. And then push your wire right through, and it holds the brushes in there. Make sure the wires on these brushes are not up like here. You've got to bring them down like this. Because if you leave them coming up here, it'll rub against the slip rings and wear them out. So you just kind of push them down here. And then this here is actually ready to install. First you take your regulator and put it back in here. Like so. Then your brushes go on top of it. And this little wire is going to stick out that hole, and then later when you put it all together you can pull the wire out. Something like so. And the next thing is to put this diode trio back on. And that goes like so. That. And this goes in here. This thing in here goes there. And this other bolt goes there. Now you have to remember, these bolts, some of them are insulated and then some aren't. See, this has a little bit of an insulation right there, that little plastic thing. Where this one isn't. It's just a straight bolt. So what you have to remember is there's an insulated one here, insulated one here, and the plain one over here. And you tighten them up, make sure they're all tight. Once we've put all this together, we're really ready to put these windings in. Make sure all the bolts are tight. You can push this wire a little bit further in, like this. Check these windings, make sure they're all good. No nicks in them, or you can also test them with a test. Put one on the ground here, make sure you got a good ground. And check each one. This one, and this one. If there's no beeping sound, then you're good. Now if you check from these to here, there should be a beeping sound, because they're hooked up together. They're all good. Wires match up with the bolts there. Push them in and put your 3 little bolts back in. Make sure you tighten them all up. I like to put a little extra grease in there before I put it all together. Even though it's a new bearing, I just like to put a little extra on there. I guess I put a little of this lithium grease in. Doesn't have to be very much. And then push that wire down so it's not in the way here. Then we can slip this back in. And we put our bolts back in. We can put a little anti-seize on these bolts. We put a little anti-seize on here, so the next time you want to take it apart, it'll be a lot easier. And it's a lot cheaper to buy a rebuild kit than it is to buy a new alternator. And for approximately $50, you can have just like a new alternator. There, once you've put that in, You can pull this wire out, and the brushes there should be good. And that's how I rebuild an alternator. On this alternator I used some different parts from different alternators. Just got them from my collection. I've used new bearings on this one, but I used some used parts because they were still good. And if you rebuild your own alternator, you can save hundreds of dollars actually, because they probably cost $200–300, whereas a kit, if you put all new parts in it, probably cost you, I don't know, $50–60 at the most, and you got yourself a new alternator.